So the next pyramid that we have is pyramid of biomass. And pyramid of biomass is comparatively more fundamental as compared to the pyramid of number. Why? Because instead of taking into account a geometrical factor, now they start taking into account a quantitative relationship between the standing crops of different organisms. So if I have to define what is pyramid of biomass basically depicts the amount of dry mass of an organic matter in grams per meter square. So that's why this becomes much better way of looking at things than pyramid of number. So first you need to remember that if we talk about a forest or a grassland, there is generally a gradual decrease in the biomass of organisms at successive levels from the producers to the top carnivores, and that's why this will be upright. And if in case of a pond, if we talk about, the producers are small organisms, their biomass is least, and this value gradually shows an increase towards the apex of the pyramid, thus making the pyramid inverted in shape. So if you look at these two diagrams, this you have for a forest or a grassland, and this is for a pond or underwater. So this is upright and this pyramid is inverted. So that's why again we see this. Then the third pyramid is pyramid of energy, and pyramid of energy is the most important pyramid that we have. The best, you can say, of the three types of ecological pyramid, energy pyramids give the best picture of overall nature of the ecosystem, and that's why these are very, very important. So here the number and the weight of organisms at any level, they depend not only on the amount of fixed energy present at one time in the energy level or the trophic level just below, but also on the rate at which the food is being produced. So both the things matter here. So that's why we can say that in contrast with the pyramids of numbers and biomass, which are pictures of standing situations like organisms present at a moment, the pyramid of energy is a picture of the rates of passage of food or mass through the food chain, and in shape it is always upright, as in most of the cases there is always a gradual decrease in the energy content at a specific trophic level from the producers to various consumers. So this is what happens, and that's why pyramid of energy is always the best way to depict the food relationship between various trophic levels. So if you look at this particular picture, you would understand that starting from producers, as we go up the order, the amount of usable energy available at a trophic level, that starts to decrease. So something that we discussed as a 10% rule, and at each point there is a loss that is happening in terms of heat, and most of the energy is being lost due to this, and then finally this all is going to the decomposers. Then the last point in this is basically to look at the drawbacks of ecological pyramids. First of all, the ecological pyramids do not take into account the same species belonging to two or more trophic levels. What do we mean here? For example, you may have an animal which can belong to a secondary consumer also, and it can be a tertiary consumer as well. So for example, if it is eating a herbivore, in that case that animal becomes a secondary consumer. But if at all, if it is eating a carnivore or an omnivore, in that case it becomes tertiary consumer. So that's why this is one thing that is not accounted for. Whenever we count the number or we see the biomass or we see the energy transfer, we are just looking at a particular organism in a given trophic level. We do not account for one organism being at different trophic levels. So this is one drawback. Then it assumes a simple food chain, something that almost never exists in nature. It does not accommodate a food web. So again, if you notice, we were just talking about a single line of passage of food. We were not talking about a food web, and that's why this is another drawback. Then next is saprophytes are not given any place in ecological pyramid, even though they play a vital role in the ecosystem. So what are saprophytes? Saprophytes are basically detrivores, right? So if you talk about fungi or you talk about bacteria and other decomposers and detrivores, they all are saprophytes. So the saprophytes have not been accounted for when it comes to an ecological pyramid. So that's why these three can be seen as the drawbacks of ecological pyramid. Another point which can be important for your prelims examination. So the last topic in this part of discussion is ecological succession. Now you see, a very important characteristic of all the communities is the fact that the composition and structure constantly changes in response to the changing environmental conditions, and this is something which is also called as adaptation. And this change is very orderly and sequential, and it is parallel with the changes in the physical environment. So these changes lead finally to a community which is near equilibrium with the environment, and that's why it is called as the climax community. So we start with a community which is called as a pioneer community, and finally we move on to a community which is called as climax community. So what is climax and what is pioneer community? We'll just have a discussion on that. You can say that the gradual and fairly predictable change in the species composition of a given area is called as ecological succession. So gradual and fairly predictable change in the species composition of a given area is called as ecological succession. So during succession, some species colonize an area and then their populations become more numerous, whereas populations of other species decline and even disappear. So the entire sequence of communities that successively change in a given area are called as seers. The individual transitional community are termed as seral stages or seral communities. So what happens is, in successive seral stages there is a change in the diversity of species, and there is an increase in the number of species and the organisms, as well as the total biomass of that given area. So that's why the present day communities in the world have come to become of succession that has occurred over millions of years since life started on earth. So that's why we can say that succession is a process that starts where no living organisms are there, and these could be areas where it can either start from an area where presently there is no organism but there used to be an organism, or it can start from an area where there has never been an organism. So it can be from areas where no living organisms have ever existed, or it can be in areas which has lost all the living organisms that existed in that area. So if it is starting very new, very fresh, where no organism ever existed, in that case you would call it a primary succession. Or if it is the second case where the area has lost all the organisms that existed there, in that case you would call it a secondary succession. So this is the difference between a primary succession and secondary succession. So at any time during primary or secondary succession, natural or human induced disturbances can convert a particular seral stage of succession into an earlier stage. So if you have to take an example of primary succession, you can take let's say newly cooled lava as an example, or a bare rock, or a newly created pond or a reservoir. All these kind of things can be seen as a primary succession. Now the establishment of a new biotic community is generally slow. Before a biotic community of a diverse organism can become established, there must be soil. That's the first requirement. Now depending mostly on the climate, it naturally takes several hundred to several thousand years for soil to be fertile or to be established on bare rock. So this is the reason why you will see that primary succession will be very, very slow. Compared to that, secondary succession actually begins in areas where natural biotic communities have been destroyed. For example, you can talk about abundant farmlands or burned or cut forest, lands that have been flooded. So all these are secondary successions. So since some soil or sediment is already present there, the secondary succession is always faster. This is always faster as compared with primary succession. Now, if you observe, generally when we talk about the description of ecological succession, we normally talk about the changes in vegetation. Now, if you look at this particular point, at any time during primary or secondary succession, natural or human induced disturbances can convert a particular serial stage of succession to an earlier stage. And apart from that, these kind of disturbances can also create new kinds of conditions that can support one particular organism or species and disturb or sometimes discourage and eliminate the other species. So this all happens with ecological succession. Now, next thing that we need to discuss is succession of plants, because most of the times when you are talking about ecological succession, we are talking about vegetation as we just discussed. So that's why we need to discuss succession of plants. So based on the nature of the habitat, the succession of plants is called hydrarch or xerarch. So what is hydrarch or what is xerarch? So the hydrarch succession takes place in wetter areas and the successional series progress from hydric to mesic conditions. What is mesic? Something which is neither too wet nor too dry. So such kind of condition would be called as a mesic condition. So opposite to this is a xerarch condition, where the succession takes place in dry areas and the series progress from xeric to mesic conditions. The species that invade a bare area are called as pioneer species. We just discussed this, that the first species would be called as a pioneer species and the last would be called as a climax species. Then in primary succession on rocks, these are usually lichens which are able to secrete acids to dissolve rock, helping in weathering and soil formation. So key point here is the fact that in primary succession on rocks, usually lichens are the ones which are pioneer species. Also, these later pave way for some very small plants like bryophytes, which are able to take hold of small amount of soil. So what are bryophytes? Bryophytes basically are small plants, like you can talk about moss or liverworts or hornworts. So these are the buffer species between the pioneer species and the other species that are going to come after bryophytes. So they are with time succeeded by bigger plants, and after several more stages, ultimately a stable climax forest community is formed. So the climax community remains stable as long as the environment remains unchanged. With time, the xerophytic habitat gets converted into a mesophytic one. So this will happen for xerophytic as well, and this will happen for a hydrarch community as well. Now next is primary succession in water. So in water, the pioneers are small phytoplanktons. They are replaced with time by free floating angiosperms, then by rooted hydrophytes, sedges, grasses, and finally the trees. So the climax again would be a forest. With time, water body is converted into land. So this is very, very important point. Now if we talk about secondary succession, then the species that invade depend on the conditions of the soil, availability of water, the environment, as also the seeds or other propagules that are present. So since soil is already there, the rate of succession is much faster, and hence the climate is also reached much more quickly. So which of the following is faster, primary succession or secondary succession? The answer would be secondary succession. Why? Because there is already a presence of soil, or if soil is present, obviously nutrients are present, and that's why this is easily done, or it's easier to carry out than a primary succession. So first of all, phytoplanktons will exist. From there you'll come here to submerged plant stages. Then from there you would have the free floating plants for the first time. From there you move on to reed swamp stage. Then from there marsh meadow stage will be formed, scrub stage will come here, and then finally you have a forest. So ultimately the water body got converted into land or a forest. Now what is also very important to understand is that in succession, particularly when we talk about primary succession, it is a very slow process. It may take thousands of years for the climax to be reached. Another important factor is that all successions, whether taking place in water or taking place in land, they proceed to a very similar stage, that is a mesic stage, which is neither too low nor too high in its water content. So this is all about ecological succession. Now we come to the next part of your discussion, which is flow of matter. Now when we talk about flow of matter, we are basically talking about the elements and compounds that make up the nutrients, and these basically move continuously through air, water, soil, rock and living organisms within the ecosystem in cycles called as biogeochemical cycles. So all the things that we are going to discuss in this part of the lecture is basically about the biogeochemical cycles. So in other words, it is also called as nutrient cycles. Now when we say this biogeochemical cycle, we'll normally not discuss all the elements or all the compounds, but only the ones which are very, very important, some of the most important chemicals, or you can say elements, which are present in air, in water and on land, which are very, very essential for the survival of the entire ecosystem. Now before we move on to the discussion on flow of matter and we'll come to all the cycles one by one, the very first thing that I need to discuss here are the three principles of sustainability. One of it we have already seen while talking about the flow of energy. The second, with flow of matter, is the second very important factor. So what are these principles of sustainability? First of all, so principles of sustainability, there are three very, very major important points here, and please remember these 3 points. First, the reliance on solar energy. Now if I have to talk about what are the 3 factors that will keep the ecosystem alive, then you have the answer here. First is the reliance on solar energy. Why? Because we need energy. For everything or anything that happens in the ecosystem, you need energy. And the primary source of energy for the earth is nothing but the sun. So that's why the reliance on solar energy is the very first principle of sustainability. So the sun warms the planet and provides energy that plants use to produce food for themselves and for us and most of the other animals. The sun also powers indirect forms of solar energy such as wind, flowing water, which can be used to produce electricity. So that's why reliance on solar energy, or the presence of solar energy itself, is the very first principle of sustainability, or one of the factors on which life on this earth depends upon. Then the next is biodiversity. So it includes a variety of different organisms, the deserts, the grasslands, forests, oceans and other systems in which they exist and interact, the free natural services such as soil renewal, pest control, air, water purification that these species and systems provide. So biodiversity is very, very important. Why? First of all, the interactions that we discussed in the very first part of this unit, that interactions is something that keeps the energy flowing in the ecosystem. So if there is no interaction, a plant or an animal or any organism for that matter will never survive alone. All organisms are dependent on one or the other organism for their survival. So that's why since they cannot survive alone, that's why biodiversity becomes very, very important. Then, and not only that, we are also talking about the natural services such as the renewal of soil over a period of time, pest control which is provided by many of the organisms, especially some of the animals, then air and water purification. For example, if you talk about trees, this is the role of trees, that the excess of carbon dioxide that is there in the atmosphere, that will be taken up by the trees which are present. So that's why deforestation is another factor which is very dangerous for sustainability of the earth. Then after that, the chemical cycling. Natural processes recycle nutrients that plants and animals need to stay alive and reproduce. Without chemical cycling, there would be no air, water, soil, or in short, you can say no life. So these are some of the principles of sustainability. So please remember this point, which is very, very important. So just remember these three keywords: solar energy, biodiversity, chemical cycling. Now let us begin with all the nutrient cycles or the biogeochemical cycles. The very first one that we have is water cycle. So have a look at this particular picture. You will understand what are the various sources by which the cycle of water is maintained. Now one thing that you should note here, that there are some blue arrows and there are some red arrows. Now the blue arrows are the one which are natural pathways, which are happening naturally in an ecosystem. The red ones are the ones which are being affected by us or the mankind or humans. So do observe this particular diagram to understand how we are changing the hydrological cycle or water cycle. So the first thing is that we all know that water is necessary for life on the earth, right? And there is a very fixed supply of water on our planet. Now what happens is, if you talk about the hydrological cycle or the water cycle, it collects and purifies and distributes the supply of water. So what does it do? You can say that it collects, purifies and distributes. Collects, purifies and distributes the supply of water to everything that is required or everything that needs water. Now the water cycle is basically powered by three major processes: evaporation, transpiration and precipitation. So the incoming solar radiation causes evaporation of water. It happens from the lakes, from oceans, from rivers, even from soil. Now this evaporation changes liquid water into water vapor, right? And this water vapor is present in the atmosphere. Now after this, there will be the process of condensation that will happen. The water content will become heavy and gravity then draws back water into the surface of the earth as precipitation. Now over land, about 90% of water that reaches the atmosphere evaporates from the surfaces of plants or through a process which is called as transpiration. So this is the second process. Then the water that is returning to Earth's surface as precipitation takes various paths. So most precipitation falling on terrestrial ecosystems, it becomes surface runoff, and this water flows into streams, into lakes, which eventually carry water back to the oceans. Finally, the water will be carried back to the oceans, from which it can evaporate again, and then the same cycle will keep on repeating. So some surface water also seeps into the upper layer of the soil, also to the lakes, to the streams, to the back into the atmosphere. Some precipitation is converted into ice that is stored in the glaciers usually for very long amount of time. Some precipitation would sink through the soil and the rocks which are present there, and will lead to the formation of layer of water or underground water, which is also called as aquifers, and some of it will become groundwater. Now a very small amount of water ends up in the living components of the ecosystem. How? The roots of the plants will absorb some of this water, most of which will evaporate from the plant leaves back into the atmosphere. But some will combine with carbon dioxide, as we just discussed, during the process of photosynthesis, and this will form something like glucose, which will be used for energy purposes. Now eventually these all compounds are broken down in the plant cells, which basically releases water back into the environment. So the consumers get their water from the food and by drinking it. So either it will come from the plants or it will come from the water sources directly. Now throughout this water cycle, there are many natural processes that purify water. For example, evaporation, and after that precipitation. See, this basically acts as a natural process of distillation that removes all the impurities that were dissolved in water. Also, the water that is flowing through the ground, also the water that is flowing through the streams or rivers, etc., they also get partially purified by the action of decomposing bacteria. Now, as long as these natural processes are not overloaded, but we do disturb the water cycle, and that's what all these red arrows are showing you, that how we disturb the normal or natural water cycle. So see, the problem is only approximately 0.024% of Earth's water supply is available as liquid fresh water in accessible groundwater deposits and in lakes and rivers or streams, etc. Most of the others are something which is too salty for us to use, or they are stored in ice, or they are too deep underground. So all these kind of factors leave us with only about 0.024% of water that is usable for us. So that's a very problematic part. Now we definitely enter the water cycle and we change it. How do we do that? First of all, by withdrawing a very large quantity of fresh water faster than it can be replaced. Then we also cover land and buildings and pavement, etc., which reduces the recharge of the aquifers. So by holding the water above the ground, we do not let it percolate. So this also increases the runoff, which in turn increases flooding, or it can lead to soil erosion. All these kind of things can happen. So that's why we need to look into this particular aspect, that we do not disturb the natural water cycle or hydrological cycle, so that we have more of fresh water or usable water present with us for various purposes. Then the next cycle that we have is the carbon cycle. Now in carbon cycle also, please note the red and the blue arrows, because this will help you understand what is natural and what is man-made. So talking about the carbon cycle, the very first thing is that we all know carbon is the basic building block of the DNA, protein, carbohydrates, all the other organic compounds which are necessary for life. It circulates through the biosphere, the atmosphere, and the parts of water or hydrosphere, and all this happens in all these ways. So the carbon cycle basically is termed or is based upon the circulation of carbon dioxide, which we all know that is approximately 0.04% of the volume of atmosphere. Now carbon dioxide is a very key component of the atmosphere's thermostat. Why? Because if the carbon cycle removes too much of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere will cool, and if it generates too much of carbon dioxide, the atmosphere will get warmer. So both the things are not right. So even if there is a slight change, whether natural or man-made, it will ultimately lead to a change in the climate of the earth or the atmosphere. Now, first of all, if you see the terrestrial producers, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the aquatic producers, they remove it from water. So you have these two organisms which remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and from water. Now these producers then do photosynthesis and convert carbon dioxide into glucose, right? And then the cells in these producers or consumers and decomposers, they carry out aerobic respiration, and by carrying out aerobic respiration, the carbon dioxide is given out. So the process of aerobic respiration breaks down glucose and other organic compounds, converts carbon back to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or in water for the reuse for the producers. So now this linkage between photosynthesis in producers and aerobic respiration in the consumers or other kind of decomposers, they circulate the carbon in the biosphere. Also, the decomposers release carbon that is stored in the bodies of dead organisms on land back into the air as carbon dioxide. Now, in water, the decomposers, what they do is they release carbon that can be stored as insoluble carbonates in the bottom of the sediments. So what happens is the marine sediments are the Earth's largest store of carbon. Over millions of years, buried deposits of dead plant matters and bacteria are compressed between layers of sediments, where high pressure and heat converts them to carbon containing fossil fuel, right? Something that we discussed in the energy chapter. Now, this carbon is not released to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide for recycling until these fuels are extracted and burnt, or until a long-term geological process exposes them to the deposit into the air, or until a long-term geological process exposes this kind of carbon to the atmosphere with some kind of process. So now what has happened is, only in a very few hundred years we have extracted and burnt a huge quantities of these fossil fuels. Now what this has done is that this has added a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If you look at this arrow, that's why it has been kept thicker compared to all the other arrows. So whatever carbon was being deposited over millions of years, it is just coming out into the atmosphere all of a sudden. And this is why when we talk about the human scale, fossil fuels are non-renewable resources. So we are altering the carbon cycle by exposing this carbon deposit to the atmosphere. Now, mostly we do this by adding large amount of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, where we burn these fossil fuels. Also, apart from that, deforestation is another way in which we are disturbing the natural carbon cycle. So we need to look into all these aspects very well. And anyway, we'll talk about carbon dioxide in detail once we go to the chapter on climate change. Now the next biogeochemical cycle that we have is nitrogen cycle. Now the major reservoir for nitrogen is atmosphere. Chemically, nitrogen is unreactive gas but makes up 78% of the atmosphere. Now nitrogen is also crucial component of proteins, many of the vitamins, also some of the nucleic acids like DNA. So all these components have nitrogen in them, but nitrogen cannot be absorbed or used directly as a nutrient by multicellular organisms like animals and plants like us. So there are two natural processes that convert or fix nitrogen into compounds that can be used as nutrients by plants and animals. One, the electrical discharge. First you can say is the electrical discharge that happens through lightning, and then secondly, and the second takes place in the aquatic systems, in the roots of the plants, in soil, in some plants where specialized bacteria which are called as nitrogen fixing bacteria, they complete this conversion as a part of nitrogen cycle. Now nitrogen cycle actually consists of several steps which are very, very essential, and we'll just discuss few of the key points with respect to all these steps. Now what are these steps? I'll just note it down one by one. One is nitrogen fixation. What is the meaning of nitrogen fixation? Some specialized bacteria which are there in the soil, and as well as the blue-green algae which are in the aquatic environments, they combine the gaseous nitrogen with hydrogen and they make ammonia or NH3. Now these bacteria use some of the ammonia they produce as a nutrient and they excrete the rest to the soil or water. Some of these ammonia is then converted into ammonium ions. They are converted into ammonium ions that can be used as a nutrient by plants. Now the ammonia that is not taken up by the plants can undergo nitrification. What is nitrification? In nitrification, some of the soil bacteria which are specialized, they convert most of the ammonia and the ammonium ions into nitrate ions. They convert it into nitrates, so which are easily taken up by the roots of the plants. Now the plants use this form of nitrogen to form amino acids or nucleic acids. So all these are produced by plants, as well as vitamins. Now animals that eat these plants eventually consume the nitrogen containing compounds. Now these are then returned by the plants and animals to the soil when these plants and animals die, and when the detritus feeders, they start to act upon it. So now another process that we see here is ammonification. Now in ammonification, what happens is various kinds of decomposer bacteria, they convert this kind of waste that is coming from plants and animals into simple nitrogen containing inorganic compounds such as ammonia. They would convert this form of nitrogen into ammonia or into ammonium nitrate or into ammonium ion. So this is the third process. Then after that you have another process called as denitrification. So what is denitrification? In this, what happens is there are bacteria which are specialized and they live in the waterlogged soil and in the bottom of sediments of lakes. Not only lakes, in seas, in swamps, etc. And they convert ammonium ions and ammonia back into nitrogen or nitrogen gas or as nitrous oxide. So these gases then are released to the atmosphere, and then the nitrogen cycle begins again. So this kind of cycle keeps on going, and these major processes are very, very important for us to know. You need to understand what is the meaning and the definition of all these processes that are involved in nitrogen cycle, and also the names of bacteria you should know. The names of the bacteria which are involved in each one of these processes. Now again, there is a human intervention in nitrogen cycle as well, and this happens in several ways. Now according to one of the reports, since 1950s, human activities have more than doubled the annual release of nitrogen from the land into the rest of environment. Most of it is coming from inorganic fertilizers that are being used in the crop plants. And this amount that we are discussing, this is projected to grow almost 2 times again by 2050. So this excessive input of nitrogen into air and water contributes to pollution and other problems. Now this increased level of nitrogen adds to the air and water pollution. Nitrogen overload is a serious problem locally also, globally also, regionally also. Now before we move on to the next cycle, I will give you the definitions of all these processes that we discussed, so that you should remember this. 2 things you need to remember here. 1, the name of the process. What is the process about? What is the definition of the process? And apart from that, the name of the bacteria that is involved in all these processes. First, let us start with nitrogen fixation. So in nitrogen fixation, the nitrogen gas is converted into inorganic nitrogen compounds. So this is what happens in nitrogen fixation. Then you have ammonification. The remains of plants and animals are decomposed by bacteria to form ammonia and ammonium ion. Then the third process that we have is nitrification. So what happens in nitrification? In this process, ammonia and ammonium ions are converted into nitrates, which can be used by plants. So this is nitrification. And then we have the fourth process, that is denitrification. What is denitrification? In this process, nitrates are converted into free nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. So nitrates, you can write in the soil. Okay, so these are the major 4 processes that we have. Now you should know an example of bacteria which are doing all this. So first of all, nitrogen fixing bacteria. So as an example you can take, first example you can take is cyanobacteria, something which is also known as blue green algae, and apart from that you can take example of rhizobium. Okay, so these two are examples of nitrogen fixing bacteria. Next, as an example of ammonifying bacteria, you can take as an example, first can be bacillus, then second can be clostridium, then proteus and pseudomonas. So these examples you can quote when if you want to know about ammonifying bacteria. Then another set of bacteria which help in nitrification, you can take two examples here. One, nitrosomonas, and second, nitrobacter. So nitrosomonas and nitrobacter can be taken as two examples for nitrification bacteria or nitrifying bacteria. Then you have denitrification process, and if you have to take examples here, then you can take two examples, and these are these two, clostridium and pseudomonas. The next cycle that we have is phosphorus cycle. Now phosphates circulate through water, through earth's crust and through the living organisms on the earth. Now in contrast with cycles of water or carbon or nitrogen, the phosphorus cycle does not include the atmosphere. The major reservoir for phosphorus are the phosphate salts that contain the phosphate ion. What is phosphate ion? PO4 3-. This is there in terrestrial rock formation, in ocean bottoms, etc. Now the phosphorus cycle is also slow as compared to water cycle or carbon cycle or even nitrogen cycle. Now as the water runs off, it exposes phosphorus containing rocks and it slowly erodes away inorganic compounds that are contained in the phosphate ions. So the dissolved phosphates, they can be absorbed by the roots of the plants and by other producers. Now what will happen is that this phosphorus basically is transferred by food webs to the producers, to the consumers, and eventually including the decomposers or the detrivores as well. Now in both consumers as well as for producers, phosphates are very important constituents of nucleic acids. Now phosphates are major components of our bones and teeth also. Phosphates can be lost from the cycle for long periods when it is washed from the land into the streams of rivers and carried to the oceans. So there it can be deposited as marine sediments and be trapped there for millions of years. So someday geological process will uplift and expose these seafloor deposits from which the phosphate can again be eroded to start the cycle again. Now human activity is also affecting the phosphorus cycle as well. So for example, if you look at these red arrows, you would understand what are these activities. So the activities are, for example, removing large amounts of phosphate from the earth to make fertilizers and reducing the phosphorus in tropical soils by clearing the forest. Now the soil that is eroded from fertilized crop field or from lawns, etc., they carry a large quantity of phosphates into stream, into rivers, into oceans, where this basically stimulates the growth of producers. Now the phosphorus rich runoff from the land, it can produce a huge population of algae which can upset the chemical cycling and other processes in the lakes and other water bodies. So human intervention here also is not very welcome. Then after phosphorus cycle, the last cycle that we need to discuss is the sulfur cycle. Now sulfur, circulates through the biosphere. Now much of the earth's sulfur is basically stored underground, either in rocks and minerals, which basically includes the sulfates, or it can enter the atmosphere from natural resources. Now sulfur is also released in the atmosphere through hydrogen sulfide, which can be a byproduct of volcanoes. Or sulfur can also be produced into the atmosphere by decomposers or you can say anaerobic decomposers, which are there in tidal flats, which are there in flooded swamps, etc. Now, if we talk about sulfur dioxide in particular, it is a colorless and suffocating gas. And although it comes from volcanoes as a natural source, the particles of sulfate salts enter the atmosphere from sea sprays as well, from dust storms also, from forest fires also. Now even plant roots absorb sulfate ions, and then it makes it as a very important part of many of the proteins. So now in an oxygen deficient environment of, let's say, flooded soils or freshwater wetlands, specialized bacteria convert the sulfate ions into sulfide ions. What are sulfide ions? It is S2 minus. It is S2 minus. The sulfide ion can then react with the metal ions to form insoluble metallic sulfides. Now these insoluble metallic sulfides can deposit on rocks or as metal ores, and then in this way the cycle would continue. So this is another way in which naturally sulfur cycle continues. But again, human activity is there, and in case of sulfur, you can see a large amount of sulfur is being fixed in the environment by human activities. So human activities have affected sulfur cycle primarily by releasing large amounts of sulfur dioxide. Now this sulfur dioxide can come from various sources. Now one can be when we burn coal and oil, which contains sulfur to produce electrical power, let's say. Second, when we refine sulfur containing petroleum to make either petrol or other kinds of oil, there also sulfur comes into picture. And then when we convert the sulfur containing metallic mineral ores into free metals, such as you can talk about copper or lead or zinc, all these activities add more amount of sulfur into the atmosphere. So again, human intervention is there. Now all these cycles that we discussed, see, try to understand one very important point, that what is natural and what is man-made when we talk about any cycle. Apart from that, what are the sources? What is the reservoir of any element that we talked about? In case of nitrogen, especially all the different processes with examples of the bacteria which are used in these processes, all that will be important. Carbon dioxide is very, very important. Carbon cycle, that's why it's very important. So please remember all these information that we discussed. Few of the things that were there in the picture as well as the things that I said during the lecture, many of the things will become important mainly for your prelims examination. Then the last topic in this particular unit is about ecosystem services. So what is ecosystem services? Healthy ecosystems are the base for a wide range of economic, environmental and aesthetic goods and services. The products of ecosystem processes are known as ecosystem services. So what are ecosystem services? You can take an example. Healthy forest ecosystem purifies air and water, mitigate droughts and floods, cycle nutrients, generate fertile soils, provide wildlife habitat, maintain biodiversity, pollinate crops, provide storage site for carbon, and also provide aesthetic, cultural and spiritual values. So if we have a healthy forest, so many goods and services can be extracted from such an ecosystem. So all these kinds of services which are being provided for free by the ecosystem, if you are maintaining the ecosystem well, are called as ecosystem services. So we have discussed all the basics that are required for your examination from the points of prelims. Basically, as I told you earlier during the start of the lecture, that this whole unit is more important for prelims than it is for mains. All the new concepts that you learned, all the new terms that we came across, all the new concepts and the basic working of everything that we discussed in this chapter will be very, very important for the prelims examination, right? So this is where I'll end this particular unit on ecology. So this is where I'll end this particular unit on ecosystem. Thank you very much.